Okay, it's a little afternoon. We still got some people rolling in, but I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Sarah Hansen. I'm the Executive Director of Greater Portland Landmarks, and we are very happy to be hosting a presentation by Maine's Climate Council today. Greater Portland Landmarks, we have a long tradition of helping owners adapt and conserve both their buildings and their building materials, and helping, I think, building owners make their buildings more resilient to the effects of climate change is just a natural extension of a lot of the advocacy and education work that we have been doing over the years. So we have been doing a lot of work, especially with amazing graduate students as interns over the past several years to document historic neighborhoods and buildings in the Greater Portland area that are at risk. We have been working to educate a lot of these potentially impacted communities and property owners on best practices in hazard mitigation for their historic resources, and also assist locals with a lot of efforts to increase the region's resiliency to climate change overall. And this fall, we're going to be hosting in October a climate change symposium called Staying Above Water. And we're also going to be launching our new building owner guide, outlining different adaptation strategies for property owners who are facing challenges from a changing climate. So stay tuned for all of that. So the Maine Climate Council was passed, proposed by Governor Mills and passed with bipartisan and overwhelming support in the legislature, which is great. It's charged with establishing strategies and initiatives to help the state meet its greenhouse gas emissions and renewable energy generation targets as it works to combat climate change, and to make sure our communities, industries, and people are resilient to changes the state is facing. So there have been 6 working groups who have been recommending strategies to the Climate Council. And joining us today are Brian Ambrette, the Senior Climate Resilience Coordinator with the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future, as well as Michael Stoddard, who's the Executive Director of Efficiency Maine Trust and a member of the Maine Climate Council. So thank you both so much for joining us. And I think, Brian, you're going to start off, so I'll just hand it right over to you.
Great.
And before I do that, I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat, and we'll be facilitating a Q&A after Brian and Michael have finished their presentations.
Thanks very much, Sarah. With an introduction like that, I think we're done and we can just pack up and go home.
Not at all, not at all.
It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and many thanks to Sarah and her team for hosting Michael and I this afternoon. We will go into a little bit more detail about the Climate Council's work, and then Michael's going to do a deeper dive on the recommendations from the Buildings, Infrastructure, and Housing Working Group. So let's get started. So we're here to talk about climate change this afternoon, but it would be important to acknowledge that we also have the COVID-19 crisis facing our communities and the country. And so with the pandemic front of mind, it can be really tempting to push climate change to the back burner. And I hope that through the course of the next hour, we can sort of talk about how we can keep these two crises sort of equally front of mind. COVID-19, it's important to say, is not the result of climate change. But it is a tragic example of the kinds of multiple and overlapping crises that communities and our states are going to face in a climate-altered world. Both of these crises cannot be ignored, and neither one of them will be solved without collective action. And what's more, COVID-19, like climate change, has an outsized negative impact on the people in our communities with the least means to protect themselves, especially our poor and marginalized communities. And so the Climate Council is tasked with ensuring that our most vulnerable communities are prioritized and the benefits of any new policies or programs are equally distributed among them and among the state. When Governor Mills came to office, she made tackling climate change a priority for her administration, and she tasked the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation and the Future with leading the state's efforts. We can't do it alone, so we're really fortunate to have dedicated partners like Michael and others in key offices around the state to help with this and to lend their expertise to the challenge that we have in front of us. There has been a lot of ink spilled about the impacts of climate change in Maine, and I'm not going to go through those this afternoon. If you are interested in reading more about that, and there is a lot to read, I will direct you to the Climate Council's website, climatecouncil.maine.gov. And there's a really understandable discussion of the impacts of climate change, whether it's sea level rise or flooding or high heat or changing winter snowpack. It's all there on the website, and you can read it. And if you want more detail, there's a several hundred-page science and technical report that backs all of that up, and it's all available on the website. So I'll direct you there for more information on the impacts of climate change in Maine. The Climate Council was established in 2019 through bipartisan legislation to address those impacts, and it's tasked with producing a statewide climate action plan every 4 years, with the first draft of that, or the first iteration of that plan, due this December. The same legislation established 2 ambitious greenhouse gas targets to reduce emissions 45% by the year 2030 and to reduce them 80% by the year 2050. And both of those are relative to a 1990 baseline. The legislation also has instructions to ensure that the state builds resilience to the impacts of climate change. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that and how the working groups address that as well. The Climate Council is charged with developing a plan to meet these targets and goals. And as I said, that first plan is due on December 1st of this year. So we're closing in on that date rapidly, and there's been a lot of really good work to date so far. The council itself is made up of a 39-member council drawing from science, industry, state and local officials, bipartisan support, and experts really across all of Maine's industries, communities, and sectors. The council is the body that's tasked with developing and delivering the plan to the governor and the legislature. But it's supported by 6 working groups, and those groups here are listed in the diagram. That's transportation, energy, natural and working lands, coastal and marine, community resilience planning, public health and emergency management, and buildings, infrastructure, and housing. And you're going to hear more about the buildings working group from Michael in a moment. Those groups worked tirelessly from October through June to develop a set of recommendations that the Climate Council is now considering. And those 6 working groups were supported by a 7th group, the Science and Technical Subcommittee, which made sure that the working groups in the Climate Council were really working with the latest science and the most specific science to Maine, our industries, our natural resources, and our communities. So there's been a lot of people involved with direct involvement to the council already, 250 plus people. So it's been a really great sort of stakeholder engagement process from the beginning with that many people involved. Talking a little bit about the challenge in front of us, you'll see from this graphic that a bit over half of our emissions statewide are currently coming from our transportation sector. But of interest to you all will be the next 2 figures in that diagram. Between residential and commercial buildings, we're looking at another 30% of emissions in the state. So we've got a lot of work to do in those sectors around our buildings. And so it was really fantastic to have Efficiency Maine Trust leading that piece of work for the working groups. So Michael will talk much more about that in a moment. And then you'll see the last remaining bits of emissions come from our industrial sector and then our power generation sector. In addition to mitigating those greenhouse gases, the legislation provided the council with guiding principles for addressing resilience, vulnerable communities, natural resources, equity, and the use of sound science in its deliberations. And while I'm going to let Michael focus on the sort of greenhouse gas reductions from the building sector, we can also talk about the community resilience components in the Q&A after the presentations. So as I mentioned, the council is on a fairly tight timeline. It really started its work almost a year ago, last September. The working groups worked really hard for October through June, and then delivered recommendations, 35 broad recommendations to the council in June. And the council is meeting again in just about 2 weeks on September 9th And at that time, they'll be receiving a bit more contextual analysis. There's a significant package of economic analyses that were done also over the last 10 months or so that will be delivered to the council. This includes a cost-benefit analysis, a cost of doing nothing analysis. So we have a baseline to compare both our emissions work and also our adaptation and resilience work to. And then there'll be vulnerability mapping and emissions modeling that will be delivered, all under that umbrella of economic analyses. There'll be an equity assessment, and I'll be happy to talk more about that. And then there'll be the results of a robust summer stakeholder engagement and public outreach process. All of that will be delivered for additional context for the council's deliberations this fall. And then, as I said, the council owes a plan to the governor and the legislature on December 1st. So they'll be meeting roughly every 2 or 3 weeks between September and November to get that work done and finalize the plan. The working group recommendations really fall into 2 categories. These 3 working groups, buildings, transportation, and energy, the bulk of their work was focused on the mitigation of climate change, or how are we going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm not going to read all of these through, especially because Michael's going to spend some time digging into that first column. But I'll just highlight some themes that come out across these 3 groups. One of which is using less energy through efficiency, and that shouldn't be surprising to you, that we can do more with less, especially through things like weatherization and high performance appliances in our homes. The next theme is electrification, and that applies both to heating our buildings and water, but also in the transportation sector, shifting to electric vehicles, both for personal vehicles and fleets. And then lastly, if we're doing those first 2 things, it's very important to clean the energy sources that are feeding into the grid, so that as we're drawing on electricity, we're drawing on cleaner, more renewable sources. The next 3 working groups were really focused on the adaptation or resilience side of climate change. So how are we going to prepare our communities and our natural resources and our industries for the impacts of climate change that we know are coming, and that even if we hit it out of the park on the mitigation side, we're still going to have to deal with over the coming decades. And so again, I'm not going to read through all of these one by one, but I'll pull out some themes. The first is science and monitoring comes across in several of the working groups, that we need to be able to measure what it is we hope to change and what we hope to do something about. And so there's strong recommendations around continuing and building on the science that has been done, and then monitoring those things that are indicators of either climate change or our progress on it. The second theme is around technical assistance, providing communities or small businesses or landowners with the assistance that they need to make sound decisions that are based in science and will produce meaningful improvements either in emission reductions or in adaptation. The third theme here is to, whenever possible, rely on nature-based solutions and ways to emulate processes that go on in nature that we can use to protect our communities, protect our infrastructure, or reduce emissions. And then lastly, doing a pretty thorough update of state laws and programs to build consistency in language or definitions around climate change, but also to provide communities and landowners and businesses the tools that they need to make good decisions and implement policies locally that will complement the state programs. Across all 6 of the working groups, there are other cross-cutting themes. There's a lot of thought gone into funding, innovative financing, and incentives. Additionally, work around workforce development opportunities, which is even more important now as we're in an economic recovery from COVID-19. And then lastly, some recommendations around education and awareness building. So that is an unfair treatment of the working group's work condensed into 2 slides. And from Michael, you're going to hear much more about the work that the buildings group did. And then I'm happy to answer questions as I can about the other 5 working groups as we get into the question and answer. But before I leave you, I just want to make an ask. We are very interested in your thoughts. And you can do that through the climatecouncil.maine.gov website. We have several surveys open, one for each of the working groups. And we really would appreciate it if you would add your thoughts to those surveys. The surveys will close on August 31st. So it's a shortening window here for you to get your feedback in. After that date, the council will be accepting written feedback and input. And we did receive last week the letter from Greater Portland Landmarks. Thank you very much for that. And that is making its way around the council as we speak. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Michael.
Thanks, Brian. Let's see if I can do this. How's that looking? Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing your lunch hour with us. My name is Michael Stoddard. I'm the Executive Director of the Efficiency Maine Trust, where I've been for just about 10 years now. And as you may know, we administer all of the energy conservation programs in the state. And that involves things like LED light bulbs and heat pumps and weatherization projects and similar kinds of things for commercial and industrial spaces as well. But over the course of the past year or so, our portfolio has been expanding a little bit as we got pulled into this Maine Climate Council work. We also had electric vehicle initiatives added to our repertoire. So we're really very involved in anything that pertains to people buying new equipment and installing new equipment that might have some impact on energy consumption or greenhouse gas emissions. And we're obviously trying to use that opportunity to incentivize people to make smart choices that will help them lower their energy consumption over the life of that equipment and also reduce the greenhouse gas emissions over the life of that equipment. It won't surprise you, perhaps some of you, to hear that historic preservation is near and dear to my heart. And whether I was paying attention and enjoying it or not, I think characterized a fair amount of my youth being dragged around to historic properties and having all their fine qualities pointed out to me. And so I'm happy to be able to engage with this group and talk a little bit about the work that we did in our work group, which was the Buildings, Infrastructure, and Housing Work Group. I had a co-chair helping me to herd the cats, and that was Kathleen Neal, who's at Maine Conservation Voters. We had a terrific group. Let's see if I can give you a shot of that. About 30 folks involved, a lot of architects, engineers, builders, municipal officials who involved in code enforcement, and then a pretty good representation from environmental advocates as well. And, you know, we tried to talk about the things that we felt were sensible that we could do as a state to try and mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions coming from the building sector. Our process was, as you might imagine, we started out nice and easy with some briefings from people who knew what they were talking about. And then I gradually shifted into brainstorming about ways that we could try to, about recommendations we thought we could generate to give to the Maine Climate Council that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We did ultimately receive more than 40 proposals, and so we tried to sort through those a little bit and organize them in ways that would be digestible to both the Climate Council and the public. And so we ultimately arrived at six broad strategies, and I'm going to walk you through those in a second. But as Brian mentioned, the universe that we were talking about in our work group pertains to the energy that is used, primarily to the energy that is used in our homes and office buildings and commercial structures and industrial structures. So you see that broken out here on this slide. 19% of Maine's greenhouse gases are coming from the heating and cooling of our buildings, our homes. Another 11% from our commercial properties, and then another 9% from industrial. So, in those locations, what that really is talking about is how we consume energy in those structures. Industrial is a little bit of a wild card. It's a little bit different there. There are industrial processes that I wouldn't really characterize as energy use that are driving some of those greenhouse gas emissions. For example, manufacturing of cement, which is something they do at Dragon Cement, generates quite a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't have to do with consumption of energy. But by and large, what we're talking about is energy. And by and large, in Maine, when we talk about energy, we're talking about heating. This is a fun little graphic that we stuck into this presentation for the uninitiated to get a little bit of a visual on how it is that we use energy in our buildings and the ways that we can try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the two basic strategies are either to use less of it, which you could accomplish through energy conservation by such means as insulating your attic, or you can switch to cleaner fuels. You can get away from the dirtiest fuels. Luckily, we're not heating with coal too much anymore. But we are the highest consuming state of home heating oil, number 2 distillate fuel in the country, and that has a very high emissions factor. So to the extent that we can shift off of petroleum products and onto alternatives, we will be also helping to cut our greenhouse gas emissions. And then you see we had a little fun here with looking towards the future with things like solar panels on the roof and EV cars down on the side there, charging away happily overnight. This is the list of the 6 strategies that we came out with, and I'll very quickly touch on them, but I probably won't go into depth on all of them this afternoon. The first one is new construction. So one of the most cost-effective opportunities to improve the heating profile and the greenhouse gas emissions profile of our buildings is at the point of new construction. So in the design, the choices of building materials, and then the choices of heating systems and what we do with the building envelope. So that's category number 1, new construction. Category number 2, we try to focus just on the heating systems, heating and cooling, but obviously in Maine, primarily we're talking about heating systems and how it might be that we could transition to cleaner and more efficient heating systems. Category or strategy number 3 is going back to buildings again and looking at the envelope or the shell of the building and thinking about ways that we can improve the efficiency and the resilience of those building envelopes. So that's existing structures as opposed to new construction. Strategy 4 is really the greatest hits. That's the suggestions that the group came up with to present to the Climate Council of the best things that we could take from strategies 1, 2, and 3 and recommend that the state do with its public dollars. Because when you're using public dollars, you have a lot more say on what you will and will not tolerate, as you all know very well. So that was a little call out box that we created to really drive home some areas where we thought the state could try to get some early wins and lead by example. Strategy 5 is really focused on industrial processes. In Maine, our industrial sector is dominated by paper mills. In But we do have some other fabrication plants in the state. We have obviously shipbuilding at BIW. We have a lot of chip manufacturing around the Portland airport. So these folks use a tremendous amount of energy, and they are excellent candidates for energy conservation projects. They've already done most shifting generally to natural gas. So that is what strategy number 5 was. And then strategy number 6 was really just about an enabling strategy to make sure that the grid is optimized and modernized so that it will be there to serve a lot of the fuel switching that we envision happening as people shift off of petroleum for their transportation and home heating onto alternatives. And it looks right now like those alternatives are likely to involve electricity. Can I just do a quick check with Sarah and Brian, make sure everyone can hear me okay? I got a little message saying that my internet was not doing great, but so far so good, thumbs up? Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was muted, but yeah, there's been a little funkiness, but overall, it's good.
All right, I could go in and hardwire in if it gets worse. So wave at me if it looks like I need to shift locations.
Will do.
So I don't know how relevant strategy number 1 about new construction is to the folks in the historic preservation community. As you know, when policymakers talk about policies and programs impacting new construction, they're mostly thinking of starting from scratch. Obviously, gut rehabs and major renovations would also typically fall under the building code. But really what most folks are thinking about when they're talking about this is starting from scratch construction. So the lead recommendation was to get serious about our building codes in this state, which we haven't been for much too long. And put together, combine the increasingly stringent building codes from an energy standpoint and an emissions standpoint, and marry that with better education and training for both the code enforcement officers who have to implement and enforce the code, and then also the building community who will be constructing these homes and commercial properties. There's been little to none of that in this state for a really long time. And there are now resources available to get going on some of that. And our organization is also going to chip in and try to do more in the way of training for builders. So I'm pretty hopeful. And the law, there was a change in the law a year ago requiring the state to start to catch up on the most recent IECC codes. I don't know how you all feel about codes. I'm sure you're always concerned that there's going to be proper consideration given to historic structures and exceptions or waivers where appropriate. And I encourage you to keep reminding folks of where those need to be remembered. I would say nobody ever desires to, would want to pass a code that, with the purpose of overlooking that. But because I think in folks' minds, they're thinking of brand new, they're thinking of what is happening in 99% of the cases, and that's somebody going out in a greenfield site and building a new building. They're really not thinking about historic buildings so much being impacted by this. But I know I now have a seat on the board, the technical board that's overseeing the codes. And so I'm trying to educate myself quickly and understand all the nuances, but I do think we need to do a better job in this state on our building codes. But what we're starting to see in other jurisdictions, places like say Vancouver, British Columbia, is setting the bar, not right now, but maybe a few years from now. And in the case of Maine, we were talking about 2035. So that's 15 years from now, but setting the bar very, very high. so that a newly constructed building starting at that point would be net zero emissions. And so that would mean it would be extremely well insulated, probably to something like passive house standards, and also have its own sources of energy using presumably photovoltaics. Some interim steps that we might consider taking, and we are considering doing in the state, would be to make any new construction PV ready and EV ready. And then I already mentioned some of the education and training that we think would be helpful. But as you can see, the economics of this are quite strong. When you do it right the first time, the old adage is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The lifetime savings from the energy savings is significant. So you can imagine the economic value of saving 500 gallons of heating oil a year would be very meaningful. And studies have shown that the incremental cost to build to this level is far outweighed by the savings over the lifetime of the reduced energy consumption. Strategy 2 I mentioned earlier was the transition to cleaner heating and cooling systems. We have really 2 tools in the toolbox. There are programs like the ones we operate at Efficiency Maine to provide financial incentives. You can do it the way we do it. You can also do it through tax credits or other kinds of financial incentives. But I think that would probably be cost prohibitive to do over the couple of decades that we're going to need to pursue this to ultimately shift most of Maine's heating away from fossil fuels. And so I think at some point you're likely going to have to envision regulations that come in that say, when the old one dies, whatever it was, starting in such and such a year out in the future, we will be insisting that any new replacement equipment would have to meet certain minimum greenhouse gas emission standards. In Vancouver, that level is can't be any dirtier than, it's requiring on-site emissions of 0 greenhouse gas emissions. Well, the only way you can do that is through electric. So they're allowing either electric resistance or heat pumps and heat pump water heaters. So I don't know when that day might come, but that's one of the recommendations that came out of this group, was to look at doing tighter regulations in the future for replacement heating systems. And you can see over here on the right, the emissions profile of a typical oil boiler in blue or a brand new high efficiency oil boiler in orange, and compare that to a high performance heat pump using the grid of today. Today's electric grid supplied by majority of the supply from today's grid comes from natural gas fired power plants, and still it's 60% cleaner in terms of CO2 emissions. As the grid gradually shifts to more and more renewable energy with wind and solar and hydro, you would expect to see that gray bar shrinking and getting lower and lower and eventually down to 0. This is just a result of the modeling that was done on some scenarios we put forward to Brian and his colleagues. What if we shifted to away from all the fossil fuels that we use now to a level of either replacing it with 90% heat pumps, if that were possible, or 60%, basically 2/3 heat pumps and 1/3 some kind of renewable fuel. Those are hydrogen-based fuels. And what you see on this graph on the right is the blue line along the top is the baseline, which shows some pretty good reductions over the next 30 years. But really, those curves that go down to the bottom, those are 3 very plausible scenarios, very aggressive but plausible scenarios, using heat pump technology that is commercially available today. So we don't have to wait for some scientific breakthrough. We just need to gradually shift away from the heating systems we use today and over to heat pumps. And we have to make sure that the grid is sized sufficiently to be able to supply all of those heat pumps. But if we did that just in the heating sector alone, we would see something in the nature of a 75 to 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Well, guess what? That is the exact amount that is our target for the year 2050, is 75 to 80% reductions in greenhouse gases. So this is showing us it technically can be done. We just have to put our mind to it. Strategy 3 is one I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with. This is talking about weatherizing primarily. This is about the efficiency of the building envelope and finding ways to improve that. We all, in this work group, everyone was talking about the programs that Efficiency Maine runs to help people insulate their attics and their basements. But there was also quite a bit of attention paid to serving the low-income households in this state. As you may know, the Maine Housing Authority and the CAP agencies in the state run programs that are federally funded to provide weatherization. Efficiency Maine supplements that with some other funding sources that we have at our disposal. And so a lot of the discussion here was just how can we do more? Because as you see in this box on the side, out of over 500,000 occupied dwellings in the state year round, all these programs combined have only touched more than plus or minus 20,000. So we really have a long ways to go if we want to do it. And part of the challenge is it's just kind of dirty, hard work, and it's kind of expensive to do. Deep energy retrofits can typically cost $50,000 on a single property. So it may not be practical in the short term to imagine that we're going to get to all of the remaining homes with deep energy retrofits. It just doesn't seem like we would have a way to fund all of that or finance all of that. And I guess I would say that's probably why there's a lot of interest right now in the heating systems and switching to cleaner fuels, because it feels to some folks like that might be an easier, quicker lift. We talked about mobile home replacement programs. We talked about modular construction, and then the window insert program. You may have heard of window dressers using a lot of volunteer labor. It's helping many, many homes in the state. And obviously doing these kinds of things are going to make all of our homes and businesses more resilient to extreme weather. They could have quite nice co-benefits of improved indoor air quality by getting rid of some of the indoor combustion that we're doing with our current heating systems. But also a lot of these strategies talk about improved ventilation systems, because as you make the envelopes of these buildings extremely tight, you do need to shift to mechanical ventilation. So those are kind of the top 3 things we talked about. As I mentioned at the outset, strategy 4 was just shining a bright light on state government policymakers, and this could easily be extended, and it's analogous to what municipal officials might consider. But taking stock of what funds are controlled by state policymakers for the procurement of state buildings and state equipment, and leading by example, setting the bar higher so that they are fully insulating those properties and installing the best heating systems, and switching gradually over to electric vehicles, putting solar on the roof where that's appropriate to do. So those were the kinds of suggestions that came out of this. I think, one last graphic, and then I'll wrap up. This is a table that was shared with our work group by Avesta Housing, chronicling the total project costs of, about 10 projects that they've done over the last 10 to 15 years. And these are all affordable housing, multifamily units. Code compliance is their shorthand for a building that they built to meet the minimum requirements of the building code. And you can see the costs, the operating cost of those buildings was about $1.80 per, I think it's per square foot per year. Yeah. And the emissions associated with that was just under 10.5 pounds per square foot per year. They've recently built a couple of passive house design level buildings. You may be familiar with the Bayside Anchor building, that green cube down on Franklin Arterial. For just a little bit more money per square foot, they super insulated the walls and air sealed the heck out of that structure such that the operating costs are 45% lower, just under $1 a foot, and the greenhouse gas reductions are 60% lower. And so this seems to us like a good example of what the state could be doing more of in putting some strings on the funds that it has attached to these kinds of projects and extracting commitments to build better performing buildings over time. I think the exciting thing about this is from a taxpayer's or a low income tenant's perspective, their operating costs, they're saving about $1,000 a year per unit. So that's really fantastic. So I think that's where I'll wrap up. The exciting thing about this is that it appears that the technology is available, it's commercially available, it's affordable. In the case of heat pumps and heat pump water heaters, they actually cost less to operate than the alternatives of what they're replacing. So we're going to have better energy independence. We're going to have better quality buildings, better air quality inside those buildings, and better health outcomes as a result. We can make use of more Maine-made products like cross-laminated timber and cellulosic insulation products over time. We're going to have a grid that will enable this narrative to unfold. But I think there's going to be a lot of jobs and a lot of good economic development to go along with this over the next couple of decades as we make this transition. So it should be a pretty interesting time. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael and Brian. That was really fascinating. And I know, I think I've had a lot of questions. I've been trying to synthesize down. And I know that we've got, I'm sure, some questions from the audience. Just to remind everyone to type those in the chat. So the first thing I wanted to ask is that, you talked a lot about obviously mechanical solutions to a lot of these issues. But I know, Brian, especially you referenced early on that you really want to pay a lot of attention to nature-based solutions. So I'm wondering how can the state, how can the Climate Council help look at things like site orientation and design in new construction and things like that, that will be more of a nature-based solution that creates passive opportunities for solar gain, cool breezes in the summer, things like that, rather than focus on mechanical solutions.
Thanks. Great question. And before I get to that, let me just say something that I forgot to say during my presentation. Was that if anybody's looking for more detail on the buildings working group recommendations or any of the other working groups, all of that is available on the climatecouncil.maine.gov website. There are summaries, there are the full detailed reports from each of the working groups, and there are actually video recordings of the co-chairs delivering those recommendations to the council back in June. So you can get a whole lot more detail than what we've had time to cover here today. Sarah, to your question, it's a good question, and I think a lot of it is going to rely on examples like Passive House that Michael talked about and other either organizations or research that's out there about where the opportunities are for that. And so, particularly with the site location, there has been a lot of good work out there. Passive House is thinking about using, or as you said, orientation to the sun to get the best, not just solar incidence of solar for solar panels, but for heating and even thinking about cooling, using trees for cooling and that kind of thing. So I think it's not as satisfying an answer as you're looking for, but it's relying on the examples and the case studies that are out there and taking those in some way.
Great. Yeah. And I think that, you know, in reference to the work that we do, so many, you know, Maine's got some of the oldest housing stock in the United States, which I know you are well aware of. And so much of that was built pre-1940. So not a lot of central air. And so I think there was a lot of reliance on these passive solutions for heating and cooling that we can learn from how our historic neighborhoods and communities were built as well. So I think that paying attention to that too will be important too.
Thank you.
Sure. So I'm going to go to some of the questions I see coming in here. First one is how do we balance increasing our reliance on our electrical grid with the anticipated increase in severity and number of storms that can impact the grid in a rural state like Maine?
I could take a crack at this. Well, I don't know if balance is quite the right word. I just don't see an alternative to significant increased electrification. We can argue about whether we're gonna heat our homes and businesses 60% with electric in the future, or 80% or 90%, but it's not gonna be a small number. It's gonna be a big number. Unless, you know, something dramatic happens with our ability to generate hydrogen and transport it and store it and use that as our source of energy for home heating and heating our commercial buildings. But right now, all the experts, all the national think tanks, all the utility planners, everyone's thinking that it's moving towards electricity for heating and cooling and transportation. And so we got to have a better grid. It's going to have to be 2 or 3 times bigger than it is now. And the amount of power that we're putting into it is going to need to be 2 or 3 times more than it is now. So I think we do a better job of the little stuff like maintenance. You know, our local utility has done a lousy job for too many years of tree trimming, something as simple as that. So those kinds of things are going to have to be taken a lot more seriously. It's not going to be tolerable to be without power for 9 or 10 days if you're relying on that for your heat source and for your mobility. But the other thing is that more and more people are adding what we call distributed energy resources or distributed generation. So having PV on your roof or out back, you know, in the yard, and having local ways to make energy, and then energy storage in batteries or in various other energy storage media is another option. So I think we'll all get better at that. Just like 100 years ago, we all knew how to store the wood and how to get the clinkers out of the coal heater and whatever it was that we needed to do to run our heating systems then. We'll learn how to do this better, but I do think we have to prepare for being much more reliant on the grid. And I think distributed energy and storage is going to be a big part of that equation to make it practical for those of us who live in a rural state like this.
Great, thank you. We've got a question about so this scale of this climate issue. Sorry, I'm trying, this is a long question.
Is this the question from Peter Monroe?
Yes, yes. Thanks, that's right, I forgot you guys could see the, do you want to take a crack at that?
I mean, I'll take a crack at it. I don't think you'll hear any disagreement from me or Brian about how important it is that action be taken at the federal level. And I mean, I won't speak for Hannah Pingree or her office, but nobody doubts that that it is the primary, you know, they would be the primary actor, and that is their primary responsibility to do something about this. I guess, you know, I think not to be flip about it, but I think we felt generally that it was above our pay grade to be spending our time in these work groups talking with Maine constituents about things that we could be recommending to the feds. So anytime something like that came up in our work group, my experience was that other people would step up and say, you know what, let's just focus on the things that we can recommend to the Maine policymakers, because those were the directions we were given. So we really did try to focus on things that actions that we could take at the state level, and policies and programs that we could implement at the state level to try and do this. It is kind of an interesting question whether we could or should spend more time making a list of things that we would want to ask the federal government to do. But speaking for the work group that I was in, I don't recall us even touching on that, because I think we felt like it was beyond what the directions were we were supposed to be focusing on.
Yeah, just to build on that, Michael's right that the legislation that's giving direction to the council did not specify that giving suggestions to the federal government was its role. But shortly after Governor Mills came to office last year, she did have Maine join the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is a network of 26 states that have pledged to stay in and try to meet the Paris Climate Accord targets. And so our office works quite closely with the U.S. Climate Alliance and the other states, both in a sort of network learning and knowledge sharing, but also in coordinating state legislation. And we've had several opportunities to send letters to Congress on behalf of all 26 states, letting Congress know what our priorities are and where in particular assistance from the federal government would be helpful. So there is that communication going on through the Climate Alliance. And of course, Governor Mills was invited to speak to the UN last year. So, there's that too. She's actually working on the international level as well.
Great, thank you both. And then I think you can both see Greg's question about the reuse of historic building materials. And I'll sort of expand upon that. A question I had a little bit too is, certainly we were talking about federal level, the federal rehabilitation tax credits have been a huge tool that has really benefited the preservation sector. We have a state version here in Maine too. Right now, those are only available for income producing properties. So private homeowners can't use them, but I think, we hope to see that change, at least on the state level in the near future, as part of this idea of providing incentives for property owners to reuse their historic buildings. And then just kind of how all this relates to you talking about the need for better training for both code enforcement and for contractors. Obviously, working with historic building materials is something that is specialized and can be, and trades education is something that we feel really strongly about promoting, because there's so much work and not enough contractors to go around, both for rehabilitation and for new construction. So I'll let you tackle Greg's question too, but I'm hoping to contextualize that just a little bit more for you.
Thank you. I'll give it a shot, and then Brian, if you have additions, feel free to jump in. I glossed over it in my recap of the workings of our work group, but we did have a lot of really good discussions about the embodied carbon content of materials. To be candid, we weren't discussing it so much in the context of conserving existing structures versus rehab. We were talking about it more in the context of new construction, but the theory is the same. And so I think it's starting to get into people's consciousness that, there's more to be thinking about than just the heating systems and the fuel types that are going into them, or the same for cars. And there's more than just doing some energy conservation with insulation. There's something very serious and important going on with the embodied content, the embodied carbon in the content. So we had great presentations from Ellen Belknap and some others from the university, Ellen Belknap at SMRT, about, you know, just comparing. It was just a great tutorial on the carbon, the life cycle carbon of, say, steel and glass and concrete compared to, say, forest products, alternatives, and similar kinds of discussions around insulating materials and the blowing agents used in insulation materials. So I think I know at least out of this process, there was a lot of increased awareness about that. I think it's a little bit of a stumper for the kinds of consultants that Brian's office hires to do modeling on. Here's what business as usual is, and then here's these ways that we want to try to convince people to change business as usual. And they're mostly thinking about going forward things. And they're mostly trying to compare the delta between, you know, an electric vehicle and a Toyota Prius and a Toyota, you know, Honda CR-V, and like how many miles per gallon. We're not usually thinking about, oh, wait a minute, if we get rid of that old building, you've got to start from scratch with all these materials that you wouldn't have needed if you had effectively recycled it. So, you know, I think the best I can say is that a lot more people are more conscious of this now and realizing that that should be factored in to the calculations. You may not see it in some of the modeling that gets done, but I'm confident that a lot of people are aware of it. I think there's a sort of an opportunity here to marry the point that preservationists would make on this with other constituencies that are advocating for the use of materials made in Maine, because the materials made in Maine happen to be a nice alternative, a lower carbon alternative to concrete and steel. So if there's a lot of, and it won't surprise you probably to hear that this is the kind of thing that politicians get kind of excited about when they think they can have a win-win. You mean I can do something good for the environment, and this would be helping the local economy and the forest products industry, which has been struggling, and these things are made here in Maine. So you're telling me we could make insulation at the old Madison mill up in Madison that we could be using in our homes and businesses, or we could be making cross-laminated timber, you know, out of our forest products and using that instead, and it would accomplish both of those things. Sign me up. So I think people are pretty interested in it, and but I can't say that there was a really specific set of recommendations that came out. So I guess I would ask if people do see in the final reports that came out of the work groups, if you see something that you could put a finer point on and make a specific recommendation, I think that would be very well received.
Great, that's good to know. Well, you mentioned earlier, the preservation sector has, you know, submitted a letter to the Climate Council, and Landmarks is going to be doing the same. And there are certainly a lot of studies out there that have tackled this issue. That I think we mentioned one specifically in Portland, Oregon, and we're more than happy to share that. We really look forward to working with you all to be your resource on these kinds of issues. It's really important to us, and I think to the state of Maine, and we're really happy to be a part of figuring out a solution, so to speak, for a lot of these challenges. But we are right at 1 o'clock. So I just want to thank Brian and Michael again, you both so much for taking this time and sharing your work with us. And thank you all for joining us. Just as a reminder, you can find more information on our website, portlandlandmarks.org, about our work on climate change. And then we have linked to the Climate Council as well. We really encourage you to submit those comments and take those surveys. It's really important. And yeah, we just linked it again in the chat. So thank you all again so much. And we look forward to this just being the start of a great conversation.
Thanks
so much, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everybody.